Hi. I've been asked to make a tutorial for custom dialogues in Godot. I thought I would go ahead and do that tonight while I'm working on the gotm.io game jam. It's a jam that happens every month, and it's really good. You can see the site is here. Notice there's $100 in prizes. It's actually really cool, and these guys are super chill. Their Discord server is great too, so feel free to go to the site, hop on over to their Discord, and come chat with us. So in that spirit, I'm making this custom dialogue system for the game jam, and I thought I would just record it sort of off the top of my head, see how we do, and it's going to be a long one, so I'm going to break this up into chapters hopefully, but yeah, we'll see where we get to. I think we're probably going to get pretty much a full variable substitutability set of resources and stuff here. So the thing I'm doing here at first is just taking the icon as just a normal project. There's literally nothing here. I just take the icon and set the default for the import, and then I start adding some folders here. There's assets, there's going to be resources, and then there's going to be a subfolder in resources for dialogues, and I'll switch this up a little bit later to full dialogues and dialogue lines, and you'll see why when we get there. And I'm going to start off here with some custom resources. These are just going to be basically holders for the data that we have. I'm not setting this up with JSON yet. Many people know it as sort of a nice format for holding dialogues and item trees and so forth. I decided to go with resources simply because they're easier in game for the time being, and I don't really want to use a JSON file for this jam. It's easy enough to switch it over to a JSON file, but for now we're just going to use custom resources. Now here normally I would say inherits resource. I just forgot to type it in, so I do that directly in the script once we get into it. So remember, creating a custom resource is just creating a custom script. There's really no difference. The only thing that ends up happening is because you inherit from resource, you don't have to have a node for it, so you don't have to attach it to any sort of node that's in the scene tree. It can just live on its own anywhere, and it'll be perfectly happy. So that's one nice benefit of it. You don't have to worry about what things look like. You just worry about what their functionality is, which I much prefer. So I make a single dialogue line resource, and this is just to represent a single dialogue line in our game. When it comes up later, and notice I switched resource for the extends here, and then I add the class name at the top to make it a little clearer. It's just dialogue line. When I go to add these, I'll have them in the separate folders, but I have these as separate in case two people want to say the same thing more than once, or one person wants to say the same thing more than once. This will give us that ability. Now notice it didn't show up yet, and that's because you can't tell due to the way I have it, but it hadn't saved that script yet, so I've saved it, and now I come back, and when I try to add it, it will actually show up now. That's only because I added the class name at the top, so just be aware of that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is export a string variable, and it's just going to be text, we're going to call it. I'm going to lowercase it because I've sort of been trying to switch over to exporting lowercase things. You may not see that throughout the whole video, but when I remember to do it, I've been switching to lowercase. Godot interprets it just fine. You'll see a lot of stuff like that throughout the code base that looks correct in the property names, but is lowercase in the files themselves. So that's kind of cool. And what we really want this whole system to do, we want it to have the functionality of being able to substitute in variables and also evaluate functions. And the reason we want that is it leads to much more dynamic dialogue. So for example, when you have the name of a character and you don't know what the name is because the player is putting it in, you don't want to just say, "Hey brother, how you doing?" Or, "Hey sister, I found your glasses." You want to say, "Hey Lilith, I found your glasses." Something along those lines. So you want to be able to really substitute in the name, and that's just a variable. And for variables, you really need some form of context. Context in this case just means here are the values that you substitute in for a specific set of values that are in the actual text. So what you'll see here in this function is simply going through and replacing the values that we write in our actual dialogue with the values that come from the context. This makes it so many different people can say the same thing, but still substitute in the correct names and so forth, depending on the context. So it's really nice to have that. The first thing I'm going to do here is just declare my result so that the function actually compiles. And from there, we're going to actually go ahead and make this the result. We're just going to set it equal to the text immediately. And that sounds weird, but you'll see why we do that a little bit. The first thing we're going to do then is we're going to tokenize our text or our result. Tokenization is a very common approach to handling stuff like this, and all it really means, it's kind of a big word, and it's sort of generic, but all it really means is you're taking the string itself and splitting it up based on some character that you see. So what we're going to use is we're going to first look up what's a good function to actually split things apart. And nice thing about the documentation is you just go through the functions and you will find that. You'll find that exact word, split. And when you do, there'll be two of them, split and split floats. Split floats actually returns the values, the indices where the splits occur, whereas split returns the actual strings based on just that you get an array of strings back based on whatever delimiter you pass in. So we're going to pass in a space, and then we're going to pass false. We don't want to allow empty strings. It makes no sense to have them. Then we're going to do max splits. 0 means it's disabled by default. In other words, you'll have infinitely many splits. You can limit that. I don't see any reason to, and I don't know what criteria they base it on. So I just skip it, leave it at 0, and it'll come out to infinity. So we come back and we start implementing that, and all you got to do here is add the values that we just talked about. Okay, now the broken result is the tokenized version of that. I should probably rename this to tokenized, token result, whatever I think is best. It makes the most sense. And what that's going to do, what the split call is going to do, is it's going to break this up to look like this. Let me type this out, no matter how awkward, simply because it's important to see what the code should be doing. I forgot a question mark there. Now, one of the things you really have to do when this is happening when you're writing this is you have to be really specific about how things are going to work. It's too easy to get confused with this type of thing. You'll forget what you're doing one day to the next. That just happens, especially as you get older. Me. Outside of that, though, you want it to be clear to other people. So add lots of comments. You can do self documenting code if you want. Make a lot of extra functions that have, clever names that make it so it's clear what's happening. But in my experience, comment is actually far more valuable than removing context for a piece of code. That's often the case, not always, but so I don't always break everything up into a huge number of functions. You'll see me adding several helper functions here eventually, but they're mostly for self-contained logical code. And for substituting variables, that's actually really easy. We don't need too many steps for this, so I didn't break it down into too many functions. I'm being very specific here to suggest that variables are going to start with the $sign. And it's sort of an industry standard. I like to make sure there's a comment about why you would do such a thing like that. It's not only an industry standard, but it's easy. It's extremely easy. And then I want to call out too, especially that we're not going to allow variables directly inside of other things to be rewritten. This will prevent us from having issues with variables inside variable names for some reason. Technically, you could do that. It would probably cause some very strange stuff, but I see no reason why that can't technically work. But we're not going to do that for now. It just is too risky. I am going to actually allow it through a very strange method in a little bit, but I don't want people to think that it's okay, so I'm going to explicitly call out saying we're not going to allow it. That might seem like a bug or a contradiction, but really it's only working by accident due to the way that we end up doing this, so I would rather them not do it and not run the risk of me fixing it later, causing them to then have bugs because they didn't have some properties set correctly or some problems in their dialog. Especially if it gets fixed and it's sort of a transparent fix so that they don't have to change any code. Because if they don't consciously have to think about it, they might just download the library and then put it into their code base again and not think before publishing it that they have to double check everything, and it'll go out and it'll have a bug because they were relying on functionality that was not supposed to be working in the past. So yeah, that's why I call it out explicitly here. I think it's a good thing to do. And so after that, we can actually move on to starting to write some code again. Now, I renamed this the tokenized result. As you see, we got to check the first letter of these words. So we're going to just loop over every single what they call token in the parser industry. And we're going to check the first letter to see if it's equal to a $sign. And what this will do is this will give us all of the things which are intended to be variables. And I don't really like to have actual constants, so $signs or things like that, directly in the code that I'm using because I might have to reference them multiple times. So what I do is I pull them up into a constant at the top of the file. In this case, I'm calling it variable delimiter and setting it equal to $sign. And then I come down and I replace anytime I see the $sign in code with that. Now in this case, I've only used it in one place because I like to be pretty quick about replacing these. But sometimes it's not that important. So for like using a space we shouldn't really need a lot of extra constants or anything like that just to represent the string of space. So I'm not going to bother with that. It's usually not a semantic difference. It's usually merely syntax, so it's pretty easy. And I'm not going to use it in many places. Next up, though, we're going to try to figure out what the variable name is after the $sign. So wherever we find that as the first letter in the word, we're going to look for everything to the right of that and see what the variable name is. Now, one problem that we have here, and the reason I structured it this way is because of this, is this semicolon at the end is not part of a variable. So what we need to do is strip off all the characters that aren't valid letters or numbers to the right of the variable. And if we go into Godot, of course string is going to supply us something like that. Just in this case, it's called rstrip. And it returns a copy of the string with characters removed from the right. Note, the characters is not a suffix. There is trim suffix, which allows you to do that, but this will remove all instances of the characters we pass in from the right, in this case, of the word. This type of functionality is also going to help us remove the $sign, actually, so we make it a little bit easier, and I'll show you how to do that here in a minute. But what we're going to do first is declare what it should become after stripping. So we'll call it the strip token, and that's just equal to token.rstrip. And we're going to put the list of things in here. We'll put it in here directly first. This is just, I'm literally going across my keyboard, hitting every single punctuation that I think might ever be used. And in this case, it's everything across the top row and all the other symbols that my keyboard supports. And what we're going to do here, in this case, you're going to see some kind of funny looking things, and we're going to get a compile error, and that's okay. And the reason we get that is because there are two values in this list that it cannot interpret correctly, and that is the backslash and the quotation mark. A quotation mark, it ends it and is interpretable in the code itself. And so to add it to actually be noticed or recognized in the string as part of the string, you have to do what's called escaping. So we're going to put a backslash before the quotation, and that will include it in the string. But notice backslashes itself interpretable in code. So to get that to be included in the string as well, we have to do backslash backslash. So that's why you see backslash backslash here, and over here backslash quote. And because the outside is double quotes, we don't have to backslash the single quote. Now from here, after we have these values escaped, there might be other values you want to escape as well. Just make sure you add a backslash before them. But what we're going to move on to next is actually, notice this is actually taken these things off of this value and returned it. It doesn't change the original value. So token itself remains what it was with those on it, or in other words, name semicolon. But what we're going to do here is, I had been thinking maybe we could use strip edges, but actually that function does not work. All that does is, if we go to it in the documentation, you'll see here, returns a copy of the stripped of any non-printable character, including tabs, spaces, and line breaks at the beginning and end. And that's not what we want. So what we actually want to do is look and make sure they have a L strip. And of course, because it's Godot, they do. So instead of strip edges, we're going to go back to rstrip. And then in order to get rid of our $sign, we're just going to do .lstrip and then pass in variable delimiter. because that's the only thing that should come before it. Now, I already can think of times where we're going to not want to interpret these punctuation. So we're actually going to move that into its own constant as well. And this might be, you never know, it might be when we're doing function evaluation, it might be anything else really. There may be reason that people need access to it so they can change it. We're going to make it a const, but at the same time, if they download the library, they could say, oh wait, I need to throw these in as well, so let me change it to a var and I'll add them dynamically at runtime. Who knows? But what I do know here is we will replace it immediately and not worry about it until later. So for the next step, we need to, what we have now is the actual name, or the actual variable name. And we need to get that now out of the context. So what we're going to do is we're going to treat that just like a key into our dictionary. And what that'll do is make it so that we can look up in the context using that key, just using the name directly, with something in the dictionary. You could loop over the dictionary and replace everything with everything that exists in the context. But there's a fundamental problem with that, and that is it's really, really, really inefficient. Your dictionaries for context may grow to be pretty large, so checking every single thing doesn't really work. But in general, you're probably only going to use at most maybe 10 variables. So it really is just better straight up to do it this way. This way is a little bit harder than just looping over all the variables and looking for what needs to go where. But it's really going to make it a lot faster in the future, and it will make your code much cleaner. So what we're going to say here now, after getting the value, notice we just go context stripped token. We're going to say result equals result dot replace, and at the beginning, if we go back and look at replace, the first variable that gets passed in here is what. And we'll see there's also a replace n, but we don't know what that does, so let's take a look. Replaces occurrences of case insensitive versus case sensitive. So that's interesting. Replace n is insensitive. What does that mean? That means if it finds something that is a variable name that is lowercase, and the only thing in is uppercase, then it'll still replace it. And we don't really want that. We want to make sure that users are being very strict about their capitalization in their, what is this effectively code? It's sloppy code to say, oh, I'll just compare this case insensitively and assume that they mean the same thing. So we're not going to allow that. We're going to say it has to match case sensitivity exactly when we're writing this code and when our users are writing this code. So we're going to use replace rather than replace n. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually pass in the values that we want here. In this case, the replaced value is simply variable delimiter. Don't forget that. We took that off the token, plus stripped token. So that'll just put them back together, mash them back together. And notice the variable names are what and for what, so we want the actual variable name first, and for the second one we want the actual value that comes out of the dictionary, so that's just value in this case. And notice we're doing this on result. That's what allows a weird way to work around our rule that you can't do variables in the middle. Now replace will replace every single instance of it. So given that, it will actually replace this on the inside if they use that same variable name elsewhere in the text. But as I mentioned, we don't really want them to know that. It would be better if they didn't rely on that because it's something that we very well might fix in the future. So that said, this actually is pretty close to finished as far as what it needs to do. We're looping over all of them, looking for all variables and substituting them. So that's actually really nice. From this point on, we might be able to actually switch to starting to create some scenes which use it. So I'm going to just start off with a simple node. I'm going to name this level. It'll be the base class in this case. And the first thing I'm going to do with that is just add a canvas layer. Canvas layers are great for separating logical, visually different things. So in my case, I like to have one for user interface. I like to have one for dialogues. I like to have the base one that, it kind of comes with the base nodes that you start off with. That one I like to just have be for the actual game visuals, so like tile maps and the player and so forth. In this case, though, we're going to just make a dialogue layer, or we're going to call it dialogue layer. And to that, we're going to go ahead and add a couple things. We're going to add some nodes to this, some control nodes. The first one's just going to be a pop-up. And we don't really need things like confirmation or accept or file selection or anything like that. So we're just going to use a plain old pop-up, and we'll add some stuff to it to customize it for the jam eventually. But for the time being, it doesn't really need anything complicated. I'm not going to add portraits. I will add that for the jam, but I'm probably not going to add it for this purpose. I'm just going to add it offline. So how things you might want to do are add like 9-patch rectangles, and that will allow you to put a border around it to say this is visually separate from my actual game. That makes it so they don't necessarily get confused. This would be the player, so they don't necessarily get confused by what is popping up. I'm not going to do that here. I'll remove this, but it is something that you'll want to do. And in its place, I'm going to put in a margin container eventually, and you'll see that here in a second. But essentially, the margin container would be used in addition to the 9-patch rectangle, because the 9-patch rectangle gives you a certain distance, a certain margin, basically, that shouldn't be written over with text because it's the border. So in this case, next thing I'm actually doing here, you can notice, is I'm setting the pause mode to process. And as long as the individual nodes under that have inherit, they'll keep that. And all that means is that when the tree is paused, this node will remain active. We'll continue doing stuff. It'll keep checking for input, keep doing processing, it'll keep doing measurements, all that good stuff. And the only reason I'm doing this is because when the dialogue comes up, I don't want things to continue on in the background. Maybe you're in the middle of a fight and the dialogue comes up, and I don't want that. So instead, I switch to process just for the dialogue pop-up itself. And I'm going to add a rich text label and some other organizational things here, a normal label as well. This here, H-split container, is a control that I think not many people probably know about. It's a very simple control, just has a little splitter in between, and it gives you the ability to let your players actually change the size of it. And one of the things that I think, frankly, is really cool about Godot itself is it's built on this stuff. And there's really no better thing to know that the engine is sound than by the fact that the engine itself is used to build the user interface that of the engine. It's very Inception, and I think that's just really cool. So what we do here is you only get two nodes, two children for H-split container and V-split container. One on the left, one on the right. You can add a control node and then put sub nodes in that if you want to, but make sure you only put two in the container itself. For this first thing, we're just going to put a name, colon. For now, this is not going to do anything. It's literally going to have the name replaced. And we're going to switch this for size flags from fill to expand and shrink center in the horizontal. And I think actually we might go back and add expand later, but the whole point is so that when we add something into the label, no matter, I should say, the rich text label for the actual text, no matter what size the text is, we don't have, or we have a little bit of space rather between them. I take off scroll active. You might want to use that. I don't like it. I am going to enable BB code, and I enable this fit content height, but I think it's either buggy or there's just something wrong with my code. And later on down the line, you'll see me remove that. I'm not sure which. At this point, I'm deciding how I want to play the text, so to make it show up in a column fashion. I'm going to decide on a tween instead of an animation player. It's sort of up to you. Animation player gives you a little bit more control, but at the same time, it's harder to do percent-based animations for the amount of text showing, because the longer the text, the faster the animation has to go to get the same percent. So when you do that, it doesn't, I don't think it looks great basing the text speed on the length of the text. It just doesn't feel right to me. So here you see me adding a margin container. This is really useful. It should be more called a padding container, and I do have a proposal out for that with the engine. And these all say margin, but really they mean padding. And what they mean by padding, or in this case what they mean by margin in this sense, is padding away from the interior of the control itself. The control will still take up the full space, but the padding between the control and the container itself will be increased by however many pixels you add, no matter how much you stretch this thing. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add this padding all the way around it. I'm going to switch it to 15, and one of the things that you would note is if you had a 9-patch rectangle with some given border, and you wanted it to indent from that, you need to account for the border as well. My borders are usually 5 or so pixels for my 9-patch rectangles, just to have everything be very clear. So I want to go 10 pixels in addition to that, in from that spot, so it's still not right up against the border. And this is how you do it. You just add it here, and that'll add the padding. Now we'll go ahead and attempt to figure this out. This is going to be a bit of a weird thing. You'll notice I'm putting the BB code into the text by accident. That should not be there. That's going to go down to the other thing quickly. Funny enough, I put rainbow in here to spruce it up a bit, and it immediately started irritating me because it was hard to read, so I later on take it out. That's not to say don't use it, just be very careful with how you use it. Okay, now we put it down there, and you can already see it's a bit bizarre having that. So let's see how we can get this to line up correctly in the center. Interestingly enough, this is not quite what I wanted. It will do stuff appropriately, but when it actually runs, it just does not work. And the reason for that, I think, is that fit content height. So you'll see me tick that off after we get into some testing. I am going to leave wave. I think wave actually looks pretty good. You don't need to leave that. It's just what I decided to do for the demo purpose, or for the purpose of this tutorial. I found this odd. It adds it to the text after you do that, but that's okay. I did remove the collapsed up here. I left it as hidden and collapsed, but I removed the checkbox. And the reason for that is this split offset will give you basically padding between your name and your text here, your label and your rich text label in this case, so between the two children. And I wanted to add a little bit of padding. If you have it as collapsed, it just always puts it right up against it. So I decided to go back, and you can see it changes stuff here appropriately. It looks nice pretty much no matter what you pick. I think 50 is a bit too much, so I go back down to 20. And the reason it's not moving is because I've edited the text itself instead of the BB code text. So I have to go back down and edit the BB code text so that it forces it to pick up the correct functionality, basically. And I delete it from here, I think, just to make sure that it gets put in down here. So yeah, there you go. And I'll just go ahead and create a folder called scenes to save my scenes in. Something I didn't get a chance to mention earlier, I think, this is all going to be open source, the whole game is. So you'll be allowed to see it just fine, and it's going to be MIT licensed too. So if you want to grab any of this code and use it in your own game, feel absolutely free to do so. One of the nice things about editing text in Godot is they have this button here that gives you a nice big thing, so you can write a huge amount of stuff in here without, having to scroll back up in that little box over there, or read, one word at a time because it's so thin horizontally. And I think that's a really nice thing, nice touch too for the editor. Now, one thing I'm going to do with this is actually pretty close to all we need. I updated some names here to dialog line text. We're going to add a group, because when someone needs to say something or start a conversation, I don't want to have a link to this pop-up through a node path. It just doesn't make sense. The thing that needs it could be anywhere in the scene tree. It could dynamically not even be in the scene tree yet. But you won't need access to it before it's in the scene tree, but you may not want to define it in the scene tree at the time. So I'm going to give it a group. That's what they're for. You could use a shared signal, and some sort of autoload singleton, but I sincerely recommend to use a group instead, so you can just grab it directly and not have to worry about, I signaled at the wrong time. For example, it wasn't in the scene tree. How do I get it to recognize that there was a signal called just before I added it? That's just too much work. So we're going to go ahead and add a script now to our pop-up, and I'll show you how to use a group in a little bit, probably in the next video. In this case, we're just sort of adding it to the level directly. In the next video, I'm going to include actually calling this from a character so that we can see how we can define all that stuff. I'm going to start writing out some functionality that this dialog pop-up needs to support. Things like getting the pop-up itself, or showing the pop-up, in the UI, pausing the scene tree, waiting for any sort of user input that's needed, selecting options, all these types of things. This pop-up is going to need to handle, and so I'm going to make sure there's a comment that clearly states what I want it to do. In this case, it's kind of funny because not everything matches what it ends up needing to do, because I move some stuff into a separate resource, and I think the functionality is a little bit cleaner that way rather than having to rely on the user interface. You'll notice I forgot to have a evaluate functions method, like I said I was going to. I'll explain what this does in the next video, and I'll implement it there. Just note that we're going to be calling it in this video, and it needs to actually have some functionality like a return value and stuff like that. I actually have a bug here that I fix later, and it's very interesting, where effectively I'm returning an empty string, which is, it can't possibly be what you return, because then just nothing works essentially, because this always runs after variables are substituted in. I decided I would pass in the text because I'm not resetting the exported text, I'm returning the text. So then I can pass that returned text directly into here and evaluate it that way. Okay, so for this pop-up, we're gonna just make a function here to call from anywhere in the scene tree. And I think I'm going to go with something like display dialog, I think. It's going to need, well, first of all, it's going to need the context. It's also going to need this, I'm calling it full dialog actually. And the full dialog is just the, it sort of represents a set of possible things to be said and a dictionary that is exported that sort of combines everything together. And I'm going to call the file full dialog resource, but for the actual thing itself, remember to inherit resource instead. For the actual class name, I'm actually going to end up using just full dialog because that's how I did it with the dialog line. I think it's a little bit cleaner than including resource in the name. But that's just nitpicky. You can include resource if you want. It doesn't matter if it's named the same as the file itself. Following the engine standard, they, like for example, curve2d resource doesn't have a thing, so it doesn't have the word resource on it, so I just go ahead and remove it pretty much right away here. And then here we have to remember to change that because I defined it first. I wanted to make sure that there was a clear description of what it was meant to do. Even though dialog line is pretty self-descriptive, this is just to make sure everything makes absolute sense both to myself and to my users. Here we're going to actually start writing some code to display this dialog. And notice this script is on the pop-up itself. So when you do pop-up centered, pop-up whatever, you don't have to call self, you don't have to call out to the dialog, it's right in the dialog itself. Nothing else here is really that difficult. Now I'm writing out these comments to try to figure out what I want to do in this function, but this is actually not true. I realized these functions specifically should go into the full dialog itself, and it should have a function that returns just the text. The user interface itself shouldn't care about how the text is coming in, it just should care about how to display the text and what text is being displayed. Now at first I went with an array of resources, but I realized with branching it's really hard to pick out indexes and say go to 1, go to 2, go to 3, whatever it is in your particular setup. So instead I switched to a dictionary, and we can then use keys a little bit cleaner. This way, go to whatever, and it'll just automatically go to it. And it's a nice little feature, I think. A lot nicer than indices that are hard to track if you have to, or if you accidentally change the index of a specific line of dialogue, finding where that is throughout the entire code base is nearly impossible, but with a key, it's just basically a search and replace. So that's a super nice thing. So we're going to add this get next line to full dialog here, and it'll return a string, takes in a context. I don't think I've actually explained what a context is. It's just a list of variables. I might have already mentioned this. It's okay if I'm repeating myself. It's really just a list of variables and the values that they have for substituting. And I check to see if the dictionary that we have contains the ID. I do a little switcheroo here to reduce cyclomatic complexity. And so it's just an early bail. And that way we have fewer indented lines, which is generally considered to be better for the code base. You kind of want to zip out of there early if you know it's not going to work. You shouldn't have to run the rest of the code if it's not going to work. So that's what we do there. You'll notice the line return null is red. The reason for that is it's returning a string, and string null is not a valid value of string in Godot, or at least in GDScript. So I go ahead and switch that to just the empty string and say to myself, if it returns empty string, then this is not a valid value. Something went wrong, essentially. So here we're just making sure that we have the calls to substitute the variables in. And then you see I replace it. We also need to make sure that we actually evaluate the functions, even though that has no real functionality yet. Here I noticed I was doing variable replacement, which means we lose track of the actual resource itself. So I switch this to line, and then I add result back in and say it's equal to line. You'll notice I have text dot substitute, which is not right. It's not a function on the text, so I go ahead and delete that. But now I can do result equals line dot substitute variables, and then a further result equals line dot evaluate functions. And here we have to make a decision. We pass in result and context. In order to make the decision here, we're going to suggest strenuously that every conversation, essentially every full dialogue that ends up happening, must have a resource in it that has the key of start. So you'll see that happen here in the pop-up, I believe. And I started deleting comments because these things are no longer true. Once I realized all that stuff makes only sense in the full dialogue. So sometimes I'll have to rewrite comments, but trust me, that's a lot better. Rewriting a comment is so much easier than rewriting a whole code base. And since things can't really depend on comments directly, you'll never have to change a comment and then fix a bunch of code because of it. If anything, it'll only be the other way around. So believe it or not, I think we're actually getting somewhat close to something which is at least a little bit functional. Now, we have to find a way to start it. That's why we need the start dialog instead of using index 0, which was a convenient reason that arrays were useful. Instead of doing that, we rely on the ID. So we have to find a way to get access to that, and we do that in the pop-up itself. So essentially what we're going to do here is define our start key, And actually, I'm going to go ahead and include the code here for the stopping of the tree, popping up, starting the tree once the dialogue is over, that type of thing. So I'm just calling them. I don't know exactly where they're going to go ultimately, so you'll see like a lot of fetching over where things need to go. But I do want to make the pop-up exclusive, so you can't just exit it randomly. It should be something that needs to be explicitly closed by the code, and ticking off exclusive on pop-up will do that for you. Now I'm yielding hide here. All that means is it's waiting until hide actually occurs, and then we unpause the tree. It's a little bit sort of haphazard, but it should work in the end. You can see I'm churning a little bit here because I'm trying to figure out exactly what order things need to go in. So we go ahead and move pause back up to the top. And because we have to account for branching, the loop that we end up using for this, which will simply run us through all text as it shows up, it has to be infinite, because a user, it's not so much that they're likely to get into an infinite list, but we don't know how long it is. So we can't just say, go for this long. We can't use a for loop here. So we're going to use a while loop. We are going to add a button so that they can skip dialogue. It won't skip all of it. It'll just make it so it goes really, really fast, essentially instantly. And then they'll have to hit the button again if that's really what they want to do. And again, writing a lot of comments just to make sure everyone, including myself, understands what's happening when I come back to it. Next thing we're going to do is write our actual loop. So just while true, there's no reason really to do anything other than that. We'll just break out of it if we need to. And up at the top now, we're going to go ahead and add a variable. This is going to help us track user input. So I've got it called user has pressed skip, and I set it equal to false. A few other things here. I think I end up not needing this variable. So those variables end up sticking in there. I'll clean that up by the time we come back in our second video. But for now, we're just going to write the actual loop. So we want to get the text from the full dialogue. So we just do it exactly like you do any other thing. And we'll pass in the context here. Let's see what do we have to do. We have to pass in an ID and a context. So this is where I realize, I need to start the conversation some way. So we're going to declare by fiat that there must be a starting ID that all dialogues have. Now that's something that you're going to want to, again, put into a constant. I'll just call it start key. This makes it easier for your users to find out, I have to have that because look, it's looking for that first. And if it doesn't find it, this just goes into an infinite loop and freezes their game. So we'll go ahead and put a little quick exit condition in here to say if it doesn't have start, just exit the function altogether. Don't even pause the tree. And that's just so that the user notices there's something wrong. If they're expecting something to play and it's not, they can go check this and say, I forgot to name the first one start. It's very, very simple, but hopefully relatively self-explanatory once you dig into the code and a few of the comments. So what we're doing here is slightly wrong because I'm asking the full dialogue if it has a start key. We want to ask full dialogue .text, or I should say dot lines or whatever I named it, if it has something with a key of start key. But what we're going to do is we're going to come outside the loop and name a temporary variable as start key. And we're going to put the current key in there. This will give us the ability to change the current key with our code from the dialog that we write. And what that means is we can add branching directly into our code. Now that can be a little bit unsafe. You might have a malicious user say, go and change these things and attempt to make this work. I'm not going to worry too much about that. What I found is players are incredibly lazy with games that don't even go online. Like, they can try to go hack it and be like, oh look, I'm so good, but it's not really that impressive, so I don't see any reason why they would do it. You'll see I temporarily changed this to current key is not equal to null, but I realized in a little bit here that it's just awkward. It's actually better to break out when you consciously want to, rather than having to set the key to null. I just think it's sort of dumb. So I end up going back to what we had before. And next up, we're going to actually start setting some values here to the things. We're going to discuss real quick just how to tween them correctly so things look good. Just get all of our actual variables that we need. By that I mean our control variables, the controls that are actually in our interface here. And you'll note I forgot to name this name label. I thought I should probably do that, make it clear what it is. And so it's just going to house the name and a colon. That's all I really want to be in there. And go and get the tween. It's at that level, so we're okay. And one of the next things here is I set the visible characters to 0. Now, there is a bug here. As you can see, I've still got the name label selected instead of the dialog line text. The reason for that is just simple. I forgot. We really want the dialog line text to have 0 visible characters to start off with. That will give us the ability to animate it with our tween. And here I'm setting the speed. This should be the speed at which the dialog text is revealed. So pretty straightforward stuff here. This is going to be used with the tween itself. It's just going to be a divisor sort of. So you take the length of the text and divide it by this value, and it will give you a reasonable speed for the text being displayed, no matter how long it is. And what we do here is we just say interpolate property, and we pass in, I even mistakenly pass in name here, because I was looking at it, what was selected, and it was just kind of an autopilot. So I end up actually making the reveal happen on the name and not the text itself, which is a little silly, but whatever. And I'll fix that pretty quickly here. So we even set the name.text to the text and then interpolate it from 0 to the text length over a time of, and this is a little bit of a mistake. I had these reversed because I was thinking I guess that the speed should be divided by how long it was, but this is the number of seconds it takes, so the smaller this is, the faster the tween goes. So I just had it kind of backwards in my head. So we'll see that real quick, that it's almost instantaneous when I pump up the value. We're just going to set our trans type to linear. We don't need any special, stuttering with the text. There are a few things that I wanted to check just to make sure, but I think I ultimately land back on linear. I don't put it in an ease in, ease out. In out is fine. It doesn't need a massive easing change. And there's no delay, so those have default values that I don't need to set. what we're going to do next is yield, and this is interesting. So I start the tween, and then I yield a signal on self called advanced. I end up calling it advanced dialog, and you'll see that here. Advanced dialog press. And what that means ultimately is we have input down here, and I'll go ahead and implement this now. If the input is a key, so input event key, and event.isAction, and I have released here. It doesn't really matter. And I just say, put in my own here, and it's just UI advance dialogue or conversation, I guess. So if those two things are true, then we're going to emit this signal. And so because it's on self, this yield will wait until that happens and then continue. Now, it might be a little bit brittle to do something like this. I'm doing it simply for expedience. I don't want this to be too complicated. And yielding here in my testing works perfectly. So I was pretty happy with how this turned out, actually. This is one of those weird cases where you might use a signal only internally to your thing, but it might also signal, like, for example, starting a new animation on a particular scene inside the dialogue itself. Could be an interesting way to handle portraits. You maybe have their mouths moving, and that might be a way to say, oh, they started the conversation again, let me start talking again. So I'm still working with name, and I set the visible characters after calling stop on the tween to set it equal to the length. And the fact is, if they waited for it to finish and then hit advance, it's just resetting the length to the same value, so it's not going to make any stuttering or anything like that. And if they didn't wait for it and the tween is just stopped early, it will set it so it's all the way there so that they can actually read the whole text. If they've done that, though, if they have advanced it past where it was meant to be in terms of the speed, then we actually want them to have to hit the button again, because what might have happened, rather than completely skipping it, they might have wanted to just see the text and not wait for it to animate. They might have just wanted to see it instantly. So we're going to put in a second yield here, and you'll see me switch a few things around here. I realized it needs to be in an if to make sure that if only if they hit it while it was in process of animation, should they have to hit it a second time. Basically, the first time they hit it, if it's already advanced all the way, they shouldn't have to hit it a second time. One of the benefits of waiting to read the text. But if you're impatient and you do still want to read the text, then that takes into account that as well. You see I fixed my little typo there. And I go ahead and add to my input map my action that I had just added or just used, and you just add space. You can put any button you want, obviously. So we only yield in the if and set the visible characters equal to the text length. We don't need to do that technically otherwise, so I go ahead and just put it inside the if. And again, make sure to write out a bunch of comments so people understand that's how this dialogue system is going to work. Now, if you have two buttons for advancing and skipping, like quick switch to see the whole thing versus completely skipping the dialogue altogether, this approach won't work. You won't be able to yield this. You'll have to use the variables that I defined up above. In my case, though, I ended up not having to use them because they just weren't needed. because I only have one button for it. And if they want to go faster than that, that's something they can implement in their own system. And I don't think it's something that the dialogue thing should be too opinionated on, so I didn't make it too difficult to switch this, I think. Another little known fact about yields that you could do here is if you have return values for the signal, so in other words, if the signal is sending data with it, say it's got 5 things with it, if you set a variable equal to the result of the yield, say like var x equals yield signal, then the var, the variable that comes back after the yield is completed, will actually contain that array of things that came back, and you can access them directly. It's pretty nice. It's a sort of a little hidden feature. I don't think most people knew that you could return things from a yield, but there you have it. And at this point, I'm just kind of handling a few different things that basically like options and things like that. These things aren't going to be implemented here. I'm going to implement that in the next video along with the functions, but it's nice to have sort of, it's almost pseudocode to ensure that what is needs to be called does end up getting called, and to include some hint when you come back to the code base as to what needed to be implemented. So next up, what we're going to do is make a function just called display options so that it actually shows another pop-up with the options available. And then from that, we can call get currently selected option, and that will return the value that has been selected. In this case, I'm just going to hard code it to next. This will definitely be changed in the future, so for now we can just leave it as is. This should be lowercase, and that ends up causing a bug later, so be on the lookout for that. So now that we've displayed options and got our thing, I'm going to add a little space because I like having a little bit of extra space just for visibility. I realized all this stuff, the yielding, all that happens before I even pop up the dialog, so I have to move the pop-up up to pretty much right up at the top rather than keeping it down here at the bottom. And I have my current key come back as the currently selected option, so that's something to keep in mind. It's going to return the key, not the text of whatever the option is. Because if it sends the text, then that's likely not equal to the key, so it would cause problems. So we just want to make sure that we remember that. And we're just going through a little checklist here to make sure I've got everything right. I'm going to actually go ahead and write the code to call this now, and I'm just going to do it in the ready function. It's not really time sensitive in this case. There's not an overriding reason to not put it here. I'm going to go ahead and before I actually create this resource, switch my folders to include one for dialog lines and one for full dialogs. And the reason for that is just simple organization. It's a little bit easier to understand where things are coming from here than if we had them all in the same place. So I come with a random name for a character, Swan, and he's going to be talking to the player. So I'm calling this Swan with player start. You don't have to call it anything in particular. Whatever name for it makes sense for you. This is just a dialogue line, so I end up renaming it just to start again instead of first conversation. But one thing to keep in mind is you might have multiples of these, And different things in the context might tell you which one to show. So that's something to just be aware of. So I go ahead and type in the same thing here that we had before from our text. I end up forgetting about the BB code, so I just copy and paste it. A little bit easier. And I keep forgetting I have to double click this thing, so it looks a little silly. But eventually we get there. We did it, team. Yay. At this point, I'm just going to create another line and use this one for next, swan with player next. And interestingly, next went before it, so I accidentally deleted the code that was there. And this one ended up being empty, so it was just obnoxious. But I do eventually figure that out, and in reply, I have the player say player with swan first. And I kind of messed things up here, not realizing exactly what I had done. So eventually I figure out, oh, it put that one first, which I wasn't expecting. And for this, I'm listing a function, just at options. I'm going to use the at symbol with parentheses as how I define functions in this language. And it'll support any number of options. They'll be in quotes, they'll have commas, and this sort of approach with the parentheses and the commas in between quotes makes this a lot easier to parse, so I'd highly recommend you do something like that if you're going to not use my code directly. And one of the things that we'll need to do is write actual options, in this case options function, so that when the interpreter or the pop-up reads that, oh, I need to show options, it actually goes ahead and shows the pop-up for options and returns the selected one from that. Now the way I have it defined here, you can see I've got the text in there. I think I'm going to put the name of the option in a dialog line actually, and put those directly in there instead. That should make it clearer which one was selected, so that we can pick a key out of it and go for it that way. So the first thing I do is put in my start one. If you remember, we definitely need that. Select object for the new value, and then you just click and drag the actual instance of the TRES file for that over, and make sure to hit add key value pair. I'm going to add next now, which again, we just want it to be an object. This is just the next thing in line. We hit add, and you'll notice I didn't add player with swan, and that's because I don't have it showing options now, so I didn't want to potentially break it by including that. We'll definitely get to that next time though, and hopefully be a slightly shorter video. We'll see. And here I just say dialog pop-up dot display dialog. And like I said before, normally I'd go about this calling into the group, but because this is purely at the root level and purely for demo purposes, I'm not going to do that. In the next one, I will have multiple characters with different dialogues in and of themselves, so I will be able to show that off, and that'll be nice. Here we just preload the dialogue itself, which is swan with player 1. I say 1 simply because they might have other conversations. Something I forgot is it auto adds quotes when you drag them like that into GDScript. So I had to delete them. For this, you've got to remember to pass in what it needs for the context. In this case, we only used name, so that's all that has to be passed in. So I make a key of name and a value of that of Billy Joe Bob. And now we're finally getting to a point where we might have some functionality. We just select our level as the base and everything breaks. And the reason for that is I realized full dialog doesn't have it, but dialog lines does. There's going to be a lot of things that we have to fix here because we haven't ever really run this. So, of course, things are going to break. The first thing that was interesting to me that I noticed here is it was telling me text length is 0. And I was like, why? There's got to be something wrong. The text, even if I accidentally use the name variable, text length should not be 0. We clearly have it substituting, and that the way we did it won't delete the whole thing for any reason. But then I realized, oh, let's go take a look at the line resource when we substitute when we evaluate functions on it, because that was just the default thing I put in to return. You notice I'm saying like none of these things should be true. Do a little debugging. Say if text at length is greater than 0, then only do all this stuff. But ultimately, that's actually a mistake. The text should never be length 0. And we shouldn't be, you can see I moved the pop-up up here to the top, or close to the top anyway. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of debugging, put a breakpoint in, see what's happening, see what the text is. Looks like it is empty, which really seems suspicious. So I go back here, take a look at this, the dialog itself, realize, oh, the dialog's not really responsible for this stuff, and it does have it. It does contain a thing at that point. So, and the key looks right. I should say the line, the line and the key look right. So when it substitutes variables, it must be wrong. But of course, I recognize as soon as I put that there, oh, duh, I have to return the full text if I'm not going to implement this, because otherwise it will return null or empty string at all times. So now let's see what happens. And it sort of worked. It showed up instantly instead of the way I wanted it to, and the BB code text wasn't working. That's when I realized, oh, I put in name instead of the actual thing that I wanted. And I tried to switch it over here, and it just everything gets messed up here. So I'm going to kind of try to go through this quickly maybe, and it says it doesn't even exist on label, and I was like, what the heck's going on here? Oh, we wanted the name text to be the name itself, which comes from the context. And we'll assume everything has a name associated with it, so we can just pull that out. And then we want the actual dialog line text, .bb code text, to be equal to the text that comes out. Now this is where I figure out that fit content height is very strange on rich text labels, and I end up just pulling it out. There's a lot of things that I go through here. I'm going to actually cut a bunch of this because it just takes a long time to figure it out. So be back in just a minute. Okay, and welcome back. I finally was able to fix that. So essentially what we ended up going with here was setting %visible / visible characters to 0 again. We took off fit content height. We set a minimum size, and that's just so it basically has a line of at least essentially one text line high by default. Otherwise, it won't show up. I did take off clip content, which is a little bit wonky. Normally I wouldn't want to have to do that, but because the content height is not fitting the way I want it to, I just did that and said heck with it. For the size flags, I ended up kind of making a hash of them and just leaving them as is. Fill, expand, shrink for horizontal, and expand, shrink, center for vertical. In the actual script, as you can see, we're setting the name to the name in the context plus a colon. I should probably turn that into a constant. I'll do that in a little bit. Here we have the dialog line text set to the bb code text.text. Then we call interpolate property on the visible characters from 0 to text length. And as you see here, I have fixed it so that the text length is on top, and that'll make it work a lot better. I yield then the advanced dialog pressed so that I can know when the user actually hits the advanced button, or spacebar in my case. After that, I do a tween stop all. I had stop here before, and I noticed that that has some things you need to pass into it, some variables that are required because it stops a specific interpolation of a property. I decided we're only going to be using it on this one, so calling stop all is actually fine. Then this is all the same text as before, the same code as before. Literally everything works exactly the same way now. So that's that, actually. I'm going to show you what it looks like. And notice it's got a nice speed to it. We're stopped, hit the space bar, it goes to the next one. I'm not 100% sure why that space is missing now, but oh, actually I do know why that's missing. So this is why resources are so nice. Swan with player next. I didn't put in my center, which I wanted in there. Because basically it was not centered, so it was flush left. Notice we can skip past it now. We'll hit it again, and it looks really nice, and it slowly shows up. Everything is good. Hitting spacebar now just makes it go back to that because it's always returning next. But there will be a simple function in there that lets you return end conversation instead. But like I said, this video is bloated already, so I'm just going to cut it here, and I will talk to you next time.